Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez torched lobbyist group American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, on Tuesday, posting on X they, quote, endorsed scores of January 6th insurrectionists. They are no friend to American democracy. They're one of the more racist and bigoted PACs in Congress as well, who disproportionately target members of color. They are an extremist organization that destabilizes us, our democracy, unquote. Podcaster Sabrina Salvati wasted no time calling out AOC, posting on X, quote, right, but you support Hakeem Jeffries, who has AIPAC in his back pocket. If you cared that much about AIPAC, you wouldn't have voted for Hakeem as speaker, unquote.
AOC wasn't alone in denouncing the lobbying giant. Democratic Congressman from Wisconsin, Mark Pocan, got in a tit-for-tat on X with AIPAC. Pocan responded to the group, calling him a hypocrite, writing, quote, what AIPAC doesn't tell you is they raise money from big Republican donors and spend it in Democratic primaries against Democrats. It's a cynical, undemocratic strategy, and since they clearly don't care about dead kids, it's all about backing a conservative Netanyahu position. Here to delve into this bickering between politicians and AIPAC is commentator Jessica Burbank, still with us, and also Spencer Brown from Town Hall. Thanks for hanging out with us. We've got all four people. We didn't add anyone since the last segment. I know, Spencer, you thought we could go as many as 8 on screen at once, so we'll see if that happens. But Jessica, we'll start with you. What do you make of this fighting between AIPAC and everybody else?
Yeah, I think, listen, let's think about what AIPAC is for a second. AIPAC is a group that largely represents the military and national interests of an entirely different country. Let's put this in perspective of another country. What if Iran was lobbying members of Congress, throwing a ton of money at rivals to anyone who was anti-Iran? What if it was China that was throwing a bunch of money at any candidate? If they were anti-China, they would fund a pro-China insurgent in some kind of primary race. What would the American people think of that? China is villainized to the United States people, so is Iran. This would be absurd. It would be all over mainstream media. How can we have this foreign interference in our elections? Their interests are not the same of the American people. This is insane. But when it's Israel and when it's AIPAC, we're like, yeah, it's fine. It's no big deal. It doesn't make sense.
An important point here is there's an Iranian American PAC. There are PACs that represent the interests of American citizens, but AIPAC specifically describes its mission as strengthening bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel relationship. This is not a Jewish PAC. This isn't an Israeli-American PAC. It is a PAC that is fundamentally tasked with explicitly advancing the interests of Israel, another country. So I do think you highlighting that is really important. And it also needs to be noted, and this is what AOC was referencing in her tweet, that for decades now, it is difficult to attain office, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, if you're not willing to kiss the proverbial wing of this particular PAC. So the AIPAC conference, very notably, was attended by every presidential candidate, if I remember this correctly, up until Bernie in 2016, who declined to go to that speaking event. And it was a big deal, right? Because AIPAC has a very good track record of successfully electing the candidates that it supports. And you really are kind of putting a target on your back in terms of having fundraising against you if you are unwilling to support the AIPAC line with respect to Israel and Palestine.
There are Republicans who have feuded with AIPAC as well. We talked earlier this week, or maybe last week, about Representative Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, who got into it with AIPAC on Twitter over his vote not to endorse sending more funding to Israel. Spencer, I wonder if you think there is dissent within the conservative movement on, what's going on with Israel-Palestine right now. I think there's a lot of support for the Israeli side and position, frankly, among conservatives, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in the Trump and post-Trump landscape that Republican voters want to prioritize a foreign country's national security over our own or pay for it with our own tax dollars.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of been a question since the war in Ukraine started, and obviously there's been a lot of sort of discontent among Republicans and some conservatives, more the conservatives on the Republican establishment, talking about why we're paying to, secure another country when we can't secure our own border. But I do think we can do both because we have done both before. Obviously Donald Trump is the front runner for Republicans right now. And he was somebody who allowed us to have a secure border while also being very involved in Israel. And Israel obviously loved that. They named a neighborhood in the Golan Heights after him, Trump Heights. Beautiful development that they have there now. And so I think, if it's Trump, I think we'll see a continued support for Israel while also securing our borders and making sure our national security is stronger. Just this week we had the testimony from Christopher Wray, the FBI director, that was basically saying currently the FBI is not tracking and doesn't have a head count on how many terrorists may be in the U.S. and whether or not they're actively planning an attack. And so that's a critical need that has to be addressed. But I do think, if a Republican is elected, I don't think that there's that much division within the right side of things right now where there would be a massive debate over whether or not we continue supporting Israel. Recently, I think it was Echelon Insights did their omnibus poll, and they had, I believe it was 63% of registered voters across the board believe that any bloodshed in Gaza is the fault of Hamas and not the fault of Israel. And so I think, again, you see that support not just being with Republicans, but also a lot of Democrats. And so I don't think that Israel is going to become necessarily a wedge issue for the conservative movement because they view it very differently than they view what's going on between Ukraine and Russia.
That's interesting that you say that because it just seems like it already has become a wedge issue with at least this faction of the Republican Party who has been willing to hold up the speakership vote over things like trying to hold up aid going out the door to countries like Israel and Ukraine. The question of whether or not this Ukraine-Israel package is going to be bifurcated has been a really central one in the days, maybe it's been a week so far since the new speaker was elected. Do you think that's going to cease to be a non-issue and that you're going to get a lot of consensus around Israel without the awkwardness of the hypocrisy of the Ukraine funding being something that so many Republicans staked their kind of political flag on?
Yeah, I don't think there's really that much hypocrisy there because, again, the situation between country, Russia, invading another country, Ukraine, is very different from terrorists attacking and carrying out what they've done there. And it's, a different sort of evaluation for a lot of Republicans on what is in the U.S. interest to have, supporting a democracy in the Middle East like Israel versus supporting Ukraine that obviously has had its fair share of issues and has been sort of a mess for a while ever since Putin went in and started, messing around with Ukrainian territory, Crimea, invaded Georgia, all that stuff. So I think it's just Republicans are taking it on a specific individual case-by-case issue and deciding what they want to spend money on. Like you said, there is disagreement between Republicans on whether or not funding should be separated, so it's just for Israel or just for Ukraine. I see that being an issue, but I don't think it's going to make Israel into some sort of a toxic thing that nobody wants to touch among Republicans.
Robby, do you agree with that? Do you see there being a difference between Russia invades Ukraine? I would as we've talked about at length, I would characterize some of the things that's happening in Israel a little bit differently. But Hamas attacks Israel. Republicans say that's too bad for Ukraine. Like, it's very bad. I don't want that to happen. But Americans shouldn't be involved, or our dollars shouldn't be going to fund this. Why is that different from saying, that's too bad, I wish that hadn't happened to Israel? We already give you $3 billion a year, though, so more American money shouldn't be going to this. Do you think this is putting Republicans in a little bit of an existential crisis here?
Do I agree with it personally, or do I think it's an issue for Republicans?
That it's an issue that Republicans are going to have to explain to their base. Yeah,
I think it might be an issue. I think Republican voters might not be as sold on that as Republican elites, but it's an open question. There's certainly more I think contempt for what we've done in Ukraine. I think there's a lot of I think it's harder for the average voter of all political stripes, and including conservatives, to see what value we're getting out of funding the Ukrainian defense when the issue, honestly, is over whether that sliver of the country that's Russian speaking will be independent and will be Zelensky wants it to be a fight for Ukrainians' survival on an existential level, but it is not the case that's what Russia is pursuing. However, I would expect, because I know that people like Thomas Massie, like Ron and Rand Paul before him, have a kind of defiant popularity among the conservative base that in the past has not been well understood by the party at large, and that Trump tapped into a lot of that. Now, at the same time, Trump tapped into a lot of that energy being more isolationist and more not wanting to necessarily fund Israel. Trump tapped into that well, but as Spencer notes, Trump tapped into that, but then governed in a way that was very much in line with what pro-Israel and pro-funding Israel and AIPAC itself wanted from their relationship with the presidency. So whether that ultimately matters to the people at the end of the day, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Trump's position on Netanyahu and Israel at large, Spencer, because when I think back to, it's now resurfaced, but Trump was quite honest about what his conversations with Netanyahu were like. And he discussed how Netanyahu said he's not really for peace, that he really kind of wants a one-state solution, which is something that Jimmy Carter has said before as well, drawing the distinction, saying, Hamas was in favor of peace, could do a two-state solution, but Netanyahu specifically could not. So I'm glad you brought Trump up there, because he has spoken about this in the past and does recognize that that is not something Netanyahu wants, is peace between Israel and Palestine, and really doesn't want a two-state solution either.
Spencer, have we been hearing very much from Trump on what's happening right now? Is he, giving? How is this affecting, do you think, the Republican nomination situation? Is he trying to distinguish? Ron DeSantis, I think, has been so strongly, full-throatedly, unreservedly on the side of Israel and giving Israel anything, whatever it wants, no questions asked. Most important issue facing us, that level of vehemence. And Nikki Haley as well. Are we seeing differences there? And have we heard a lot from Trump to suggest it would be that Trump's putting his own unique spin on the news of the day, as he so often does?
He does have a way of doing that, doesn't he? I think, as you mentioned, Nikki Haley is somebody, I think, and Ron DeSantis as well. But the main sort of tension point on this, and where most of the attention has been, is between Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Right.
Obviously, she's taken him to task. Pretty much every debate performance, it seems like she just keeps leveling up her insults against him. The first one was, you clearly know nothing about foreign policy, or you have no foreign policy experience, and it shows. And the second time was, every time you speak, I get dumber, or something to that effect. And so I think that's where you're seeing it play out a lot more. Obviously, Trump is really not, he's not at the debates. He's not really engaging in the primary politicking that he would have done, back in 2016. And so I think he's kind of letting his record speak for itself when it comes to Israel, because obviously, like we were just discussing, he was very, very involved with what was going on in Israel, was very supportive of Israel, was the first president to actually move the embassy to Jerusalem and all these things. And so I think he's just sort of riding on his record on that one. And I think to that extent, it's probably working for him, because he doesn't have to get into necessarily the current debates as much.
Yeah, I don't know what it says about the Republican primary electorate that after Trump, Trump's so far ahead that maybe it doesn't matter, and maybe it's hard to read anything into these various percentages. But obviously, Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis have extremely different foreign policy views on, just take Ukraine and Israel, right? DeSantis supposedly doesn't want to support Ukraine anymore, does want to support Israel. Vivek doesn't want to support Ukraine and is the most inclined to potentially have some end to supporting Israel. He thinks they should do whatever they want to do to pursue their security, but is the most open to revisiting the aid we give them. And then Nikki Haley wants to vigorously fund both. And then, those three candidates have a lot of differances, and they're the next three candidates who poll well. It's not like I can't read into it's not like Nikki Haley is surging, so maybe then her foreign policy views are the ones that are carrying the day. Is there any way to tell what Republican primary voters are thinking based on the state of the race between those three?
I don't think so. Like you mentioned, they're all behind by 40 to 50 points behind Trump. And so, again, trying to read any change in that could just be, again, we saw little bumps for Nikki Haley coming out of the first two debates, out of each of those. And so that was like, oh, that could be her foreign policy, but it's also such a small bump when they're so close together, sort of at the bottom of the field. And when so many other topics were discussed during the debate, it's very hard to say what it was that sort of resonated with people and what they liked. And obviously Nikki Haley seems to think that her foreign policy smackdowns, or whatever she wants to call them, against Ramaswamy are working. That might obviously not be it. It might just be people like seeing her, stand up and be strong and smack down Ramaswamy for sort of the theatrical effect of that, and not so much about the policy points she's making. But I think, like you were saying, Trump is just so far ahead that it's really hard to say why anything is changing. It seems honestly like the biggest mover and shaker for poll numbers in this primary so far has been the indictments of Donald Trump. That's really what moved the needle the most, and it of course moved him further ahead.
It's just Trump. Lol, nothing matters. Well, AIPAC responded to the New York Democrats' remarks on X, pushing back on claims that the organization targets people of color. So this is a response to AOC. More of the same tired lies and spin, the group wrote. AOC and the squad summed up, people who disagree with us are racist. AIPAC stands with pro-Israel Democrats and Republicans of all races, genders, and backgrounds who support the U.S.-Israel alliance, and we oppose those who don't like you. So Jessica, to Bree's point earlier, no, it was to Sabrina Salvati's point. You made the point before we started rolling. Is AOC in a little bit of hypocrisy here because she also supported a speaker candidate who is very vocally for Israel and AIPAC?
Yeah, but it's not the first time she's been a hypocrite on the issue of Israel-Palestine. We have to call it what it is. She was saying it's an occupation in 2018 in a sit-down interview. I think it was 60 Minutes, when she was a young politician, new to the scene. And then she went on to vote for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker and also vote present when they were voting for the Iron Dome. A no vote would have sufficed there. And so is she afraid, maybe, of a challenger from AIPAC in her district? Yeah. And it's obvious that AIPAC has bought and sold members of Congress. They had campaign contributions to the tune of $13.4 million. J Street at $5.6 million in contributions. Fetterman took $174,000 of that money from J Street, which is another pro-Israel PAC. So when we think about the amount of money that could be thrown against her in a primary race, she might be afraid of that. That might be why she's wavered, but she's absolutely a hypocrite for wavering.
Yeah, I want to say also, AOC is completely right about AIPAC targeting people of color. I don't know if it's because they're people of color, but they are, in fact, they have gone after an overwhelming, disproportionate number of black and brown congressional candidates. I think the reason is because black and brown people tend to, for a lot of reasons, including shared histories of oppression, have a lot of solidarity with Palestinians and tend to have a more pro-Palestinian position. Very notably, of course, we covered at length the millions of dollars they put into the race against Nina Turner for Shontel Brown, the AIPAC candidate in Ohio's 11th district. The $1 million they put last minute into the race against Summer Lee, African-American in Pennsylvania. And moreover, they also went after Andy Levin, who's a Jewish candidate with a bad view on Israel for the perspective of AIPAC, and AIPAC has never hesitated to use accusations of anti-Semitism and weaponize those against the candidates it does not like because they support Palestinians. So there's an interesting kind of battle of identity politics that's happening here. It's worth remembering that whenever there was that the House bill to censure the violence against the Palestinians, or whatever it was that only 9 people signed on to, whatever it was a few weeks ago, it was only people of color who had signed on to that. So there is, I do think that what she's saying is true. The reason why it's true is interesting, and it is also very interesting to watch some of the same groups, including AIPAC, that would deny the relevance of race in one context, very much use ethnicity or religion to castigate people who are critical of its own politics. So it's getting really messy here. But I just want to really underscore, it is so shocking to hear any politician, especially people like AOC, these sitting Congress members, be so vocal and critical of AIPAC, because despite the fact that they've all been feeling this pressure for a really long time, despite the fact that, to your example, Jessica, AOC was literally in tears on the House floor as Nancy Pelosi was saying something to her to get her to change her vote on that Iron Dome vote. Despite the obvious pressure they've been under, The Intercept has been covering AIPAC's battle with progressives, Hakeem Jeffries' own relationship to some of these PACs that has been specifically targeting progressive challengers to incumbents. All of that's been going on. Nobody's really said a mumbling word about it until now. And I do think this is a tipping point, and I'm very interested to see where this goes.
So are we. We will be following all the latest updates on Capitol Hill and in the rest of the world. Thank you so much, Jessica Burbank and Spencer, for joining us today. That was our Avengers-style meetup. Maybe we'll get Amber and Shermichael for the sequel. And in fact, Amber will be back with you tomorrow. Jessica, a last name change for Amber because she just got married. Amber Duke now. And that does it for us for the week.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. For those of you who prefer to listen while you're on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Take care.